Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. Victoria Somers walked into the living room, her back straight, a slight smile on her lips, while her husband, Mark Reynolds, regarded her with a mixture of contempt and indifference. At first glance, she seemed like the perfect wife, elegant, polite, and discreet. But behind that serene face hid a woman capable of overturning empires. No one, not even Mark, knew that Victoria was not the simple woman he thought he knew. Heiress to a colossal family fortune, she had learned to master the art of secrecy and patience. Every movement, every smile, every seemingly naive word spoken was precisely calculated. She knew that power was not always what one flaunts, but what one wields in the shadows. Mark, obsessed with his ego and dominance, saw her as nothing more than an ordinary wife. He criticized her, despised her, sometimes openly, sometimes with subtle remarks that left invisible scars. Victoria took it with grace, but every humiliation, every condescending look fueled her silent determination. That evening, as the wind blew gently against the large windows of their house, Victoria reflected on everything she had built in the shadows: strategic investments, discreet alliances, thriving businesses under identities that none of her loved ones would ever have suspected. She was rich, powerful, but above all, free in her thinking and ambition. She placed her cup of tea on the table and looked at Mark. He was talking arrogantly on the phone, boasting about his business, completely unaware that the woman he believed to be submissive already held the reins of an invisible empire. Victoria smiled, but this time it wasn't a polite smile. It was a smile of promise. The promise that sooner or later, the whole world would discover the truth. And Mark, in his ignorance, had no idea that the time he underestimated her was coming to an end. The sun was setting behind the large windows of the Reynolds house, bathing the living room in an orange light. Victoria Somers arranged the sofa cushions with almost military precision, while Mark Reynolds sat in his leather armchair, distractedly leafing through papers. "Victoria," he said condescendingly, without looking up, "you really should take a closer look at the household finances. The bills are starting to pile up." Victoria gently set down the cushions and turned her gaze to him, a polite but firm smile on her lips. "Of course, Mark. I'll take care of it." But inside, she held back a sigh. She knew exactly what he couldn't see. For several months, she had been quietly managing her own investments. Her stocks, real estate investments, and side businesses were already bringing in more than Mark's annual income. And yet, he despised her, seeing her as naive and incapable. "You really should learn to manage your own business, Victoria," he continued, ignoring the world his wife had built in the shadows. "You don't want to end up like one of those women who wastes all their husband's money." Victoria bowed slightly, seemingly respectful. "I'll do my best, Mark." She knew he would interpret this as submission, when in reality, it was a silent warning. She wasn't the woman he thought she was. After a few moments of silence, Mark stood up and walked toward the kitchen, his gait imposing. "And make sure dinner is ready on time. We have guests tonight, and I don't want you embarrassing the Reynolds family." Victoria nodded. She stood there for a moment, watching the door close behind him. Then, slowly, she walked to her secret office, hidden behind a revolving bookcase. There, in the dim light, she consulted the latest financial reports from her companies. Everything was in order, and her investments were beginning to outperform Mark's without him having the slightest idea. A faint smile tugged at her lips. One day, she murmured to herself, "You'll understand what it means to underestimate me." That evening, as the guests arrived and Mark displayed all his supposed superiority, Victoria remained in the shadows, observing every gesture, every word. Every compliment addressed to her husband, every burst of forced laughter, strengthened her resolve. She was no longer just the scorned wife. She was a silent force, ready to reveal herself at the right moment. And Mark, in his blind arrogance, still saw nothing coming. Night was falling on the Reynolds estate, and silence reigned in the large house. Mark had retired to his study to work on new projects, leaving Victoria alone with her thoughts. She settled into her favorite corner, a small, secret library behind the living room, which no visitor had ever noticed. There, surrounded by financial files and glowing screens, she revealed the true face of her life, a wealthy, powerful, and strategic woman. Victoria Summers had learned to live in the shadow of her husband's contempt. Every smile she gave him, every polite word, every gesture of apparent submission was a calculated act. Behind this facade, she managed an invisible empire, invested in technology, real estate, and financial investment companies. Some of her decisions were so discreet that even Mark's closest associates could not suspect her influence. She took a sip of tea and opened her laptop. The numbers scrolled across the screen. Her investments were growing at an impressive rate. Some companies, under her anonymous direction, were even beginning to surpass Mark's. She smiled, silently savoring this feeling of power that her husband believed was reserved exclusively for her. But Victoria knew that patience was key. She couldn't reveal her true identity or her wealth yet. Mark was arrogant and impulsive. He would react badly if the truth came out too soon. She had to maneuver, subtly sow the seeds of her revenge. She intended to let him discover his power gradually, just enough for him to understand that he had never been in control. As she was reviewing her reports, a discreet message appeared on her phone. It was from Richard Harrington, an old family friend and confidant. "Be careful. Mark is more suspicious than you think. Don't reveal anything too soon." Victoria smiled softly. She knew Richard was right. Prudence didn't mean inaction, but a well-thought-out strategy. She had to continue building her empire in silence, while observing Mark's every weakness. A faint noise upstairs caught his attention. Mark had just passed through the hallway, unaware that Victoria had just finalized a major deal that would change their lives. Little did he know, the woman he despised was no longer the woman he thought she was. Victoria stretched and murmured to herself, "Soon, Mark. You'll understand what it's like to underestimate a woman." And for the first time in years, she felt a thrill of excitement run through her body. This thrill wasn't just about wealth or power, but about the knowledge that she was finally in control of her own destiny. The next morning, the sun filtered through the silk curtains, illuminating the kitchen where Victoria was preparing breakfast. Mark entered, as usual, with a confident step, a rolled-up newspaper under his arm. "Victoria," he said in that condescending tone she knew so well, "I'm going to have to leave you tonight. I have a dinner with some business partners. Try not to embarrass the house while I'm gone." Victoria looked up and smiled sweetly. "Of course, Mark. I'll make sure everything is perfect." Behind that smile hid a mind in full swing. She knew exactly how to turn this evening into an opportunity to establish her influence and test her first manipulation. For several weeks, she had been discreetly investing in a company that Mark considered insignificant. However, this evening, the business partners he was about to meet were connected to that company. Later that evening, as Mark sat down at the restaurant with his guests, Victoria watched the dinner from her phone, thanks to a virtual meeting she had arranged with the company's directors. Every figure, every decision she had quietly made, was beginning to pay off. The company was showing unexpected growth and outperforming some of Mark's direct competitors. When he returned home, Mark seemed satisfied with his evening, but he had no idea that he had just unknowingly witnessed a strategic coup orchestrated by his own wife. Victoria greeted him with her usual smile. "So, how was dinner?" Mark sat in the living room, leaning back arrogantly. "Fine, fine. But I didn't understand some of my partner's reactions. Some seemed..." He searched for words. "Oddly interested in this company I didn't even know had such potential." Victoria nodded innocently. "Perhaps it's just the charm of well-placed opportunities, Mark." She knew her seemingly innocuous words were making their way into her husband's mind. Without his knowledge, she had just sown a subtle doubt, a seed of curiosity and budding respect for an ability he couldn't identify. This first manipulation, discreet but effective, reinforced Victoria's confidence in her strategy. Every polite smile, every sweet word, every gesture of apparent submission became a tool of power. She had begun to change the dynamics of their relationship, all while remaining invisible to Mark. Before retiring for the night, Victoria took a deep breath. She knew this was only the beginning. The road to revealing her true identity and power would be long, but each step had to be carefully calculated. And in the silence of the night, she whispered to herself, "You don't know who you're dealing with yet, Mark. But soon you will." A few days later, Victoria had planned a discreet outing to meet with Richard Harrington, an old family friend and trusted confidant. Richard was one of the few people who knew the extent of her abilities and her true identity. He knew the wealth she hid and knew that her marriage to Mark was only a temporary veil for his own ambitions. They found themselves in an elegant cafe, away from the prying eyes of the city. Victoria sat down opposite Richard, a hot coffee in her hands, and let her gaze scan the surroundings cautiously. "Victoria," Richard said, placing his hands gravely on the table, "you need to be careful. Mark is starting to show signs of suspicion. He's noticing subtle changes, and his arrogance could turn into a threat if you don't get a grip on the situation." Victoria nodded slowly, considering each word. "I know, Richard. Patience is key. But he can't understand what I really am, or what I'm building. I have to let him discover the power I've always had, at the perfect time." Richard sighed. "Sometimes I wonder if men's pride will be their downfall." Victoria smiled calmly. "Mark is arrogant, but that's also his weakness. He thinks he has everything under control. And that's when I'm going to strike, gently, without him realizing it." After a moment of silence, Richard placed a hand on Victoria's. "You just have to remember, subtlety is your weapon. One false step and it could destroy everything." Victoria nodded. She knew Richard was right. Tensions with Mark were steadily rising, and every action had to be calculated. Her next move was to be discreet but strategic. She would test her husband's strength, gauge his reactions, and begin laying the foundations for her revenge. Back home, Victoria felt both excited and cautious. She watched Mark bustle around his office, unaware that every decision he made could now be influenced by her, without him even realizing it. She knew that patience was his greatest ally, and that soon, every action, every word of Mark's would turn against him. That night, as she watched the moon reflect its light on the windows of the house, Victoria whispered to herself, "You think you know me, Mark. But there's more to me than you think. And by the time you realize that, it'll be too late." In the following weeks, Victoria continued her maneuvers with meticulous precision. Every investment, every discreet decision, began to bear fruit. Some businesses that Mark considered insignificant were now generating more revenue than his own. And yet, he remained blind to the true source of this success. One evening, as Mark returned from a business meeting, he appeared irritated. His features were drawn, and his gaze scanned the house as if searching for an explanation for his recent setbacks. "Victoria," he said, pausing in the doorway. "I don't understand. Some of my businesses, they're stagnating, even declining. And some that I thought were secondary, they're literally exploding." Victoria, standing in the kitchen, making tea for the two of them, turned her head toward him with a soft, almost maternal smile. "Maybe it's just chance, Mark. Or maybe some decisions require a little more thought." Mark frowned. "Thinking?" He stepped closer, his eyes flashing. "Victoria, are you telling me?" She shook her head slightly, still calm. "I'm not saying anything, Mark. I'm just observing." This simple sentence, spoken innocently, aroused palpable frustration in him. He hadn't known that Victoria had been quietly influencing decisions, steering investments, and anonymously collaborating with key partners. She'd taken control without his suspicion, but he was beginning to sense an imbalance. That night, Victoria returned to her secret office. She watched the numbers scrolling across her screen. Her investments had generated an unexpected profit that now far surpassed Mark's. She smiled inwardly, savoring this first silent success. But she knew this was only the beginning. The visible results, however small, were essential to prepare for the final revelation. Every action Mark took, every decision he thought was his own, was now influenced by the woman he believed to be naive and weak. Victoria stood, looking out the window at the city. The twinkling lights reflected her ambitions, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a complete power, subtle but irresistible. "Soon," she whispered, "you'll understand, Mark, and it will be too late for you." As the weeks passed, the dynamic between Victoria and Mark shifted imperceptibly but irreversibly. Mark's every move seemed more nervous, every decision more hesitant. He began to perceive changes he couldn't explain, competitors appearing where he thought he had control, numbers shifting mysteriously, and most importantly, a silent presence behind it all. One morning, Mark walked into the kitchen, coffee in hand, his eyes filled with barely veiled suspicion. "Victoria," he said, his tone harsher than usual, "I'm noticing certain things, certain businesses, they're progressing differently than I thought. You wouldn't, by any chance, have been involved in something, would you?" Victoria looked up, barely perceptible surprise. She stepped forward and gently placed a hand on his arm. "Mark, you know me. I never interfere in your affairs." Mark frowned. "Yet something has changed. I can feel it." Victoria smiled, this time with a barely perceptible hint of mischief. "Maybe you're observing things better now, Mark. Maybe you're starting to see what I do for a living, even without me telling you." These words, spoken softly but precisely, created an almost palpable tension. Mark didn't know how to respond. Every sentence, every gesture from Victoria seemed calculated to unsettle him, without him being able to put his finger on the cause. That evening, after dinner, Victoria settled into her secret office. She rechecked the latest financial reports and observed the trends. Her actions were now having a direct impact on some of Mark's businesses. She knew he was beginning to feel a slight imbalance. Each victory was subtle, invisible to others, but to her, it was one step closer to complete control. Mark, meanwhile, spent the evening brooding. His arrogance was shaken, but he would never admit to her that he felt overwhelmed. Every word he spoke to Victoria was carefully chosen, every glance scrutinizing his gestures for flaws. But he still didn't see the extent of his own weakness. Victoria, for her part, relished the rising tension. She knew the final confrontation could only come when Mark was disoriented enough to understand the magnitude of his mistake, underestimating a woman he believed to be weak and naive. As she watched the moon reflecting off the windows of the house, she whispered, "Keep underestimating, Mark, you don't know yet how much control I have in the game." A few weeks later, Victoria quietly announced to Mark that she was planning a charity gala for a local cause. He raised his eyebrows, amused by what he assumed was a simple social event. "Very well, Victoria, but make sure you keep it simple and elegant. We don't want to attract too much attention." Victoria smiled politely, but inside, she relished her strategy. This gala would be her first public display of power and influence. She had invited influential figures, investors, and industry leaders, people who recognized the power behind elegance. Mark still thought it was just another social gathering, but Victoria had planned every detail so he would discover its true significance. By evening, the grand gala hall shimmered with golden lights. Victoria appeared in a sumptuous gown, designed to draw the eye yet still refined. The guests were immediately captivated by her presence, elegant, confident, radiating a quiet authority. Mark, for his part, was stunned the moment he laid eyes on her. He no longer recognized the woman he thought he knew. Every smile she gave the guests, every word she spoke, seemed orchestrated with perfect mastery. And behind her apparent modesty, she exerted an invisible but powerful influence on everyone present. As the evening progressed, several business partners came to congratulate Victoria on her initiatives and investments. Mark remained frozen, listening to conversations in which his own name was mentioned only by association with Victoria, as if she were the architect of successes he believed belonged to him. At the end of the evening, as Victoria stepped forward to offer a few words of thanks, Mark realized something he could no longer ignore. This woman he had despised possessed power and wealth far greater than his own. He felt his arrogance waver. Victoria, with a subtle smile, addressed the gathering, "Thank you all for coming tonight. Your presence shows how much we can achieve together, when we believe in the power of ideas and initiatives." Her words were simple, but their impact was immense. Every guest understood that Victoria Somers was not just an elegant wife, she was a woman of influence, capable of leading and deciding in a world of arrogant men. Mark, humbled in his pride, remained silent. He still didn't know how to handle this reality. The woman he thought was weak was now the center of attention and power. Victoria returned home that evening, a mixture of satisfaction and strategic calm in her eyes. It was the first real blow, discreet but resounding, that would shake her husband and prepare the way for the final revelation. She muttered to herself, "This is just the beginning, Mark, and you ain't seen nothing yet." The day after the gala, the atmosphere in the Reynolds household was tense. Mark was silent, lost in thought, unable to comprehend how his wife, whom he had so long despised, had captured the attention of all the guests and earned a respect he believed he exclusively deserved. Victoria, for her part, calmly observed her husband from the living room. Every gesture, every silence, every frown from Mark confirmed what she had long known: the arrogance of men was fragile in the face of power they ignored. When he entered the room, Victoria stood up and walked over with quiet confidence. "Mark," she said in a soft but firm voice, "we need to talk." He stared at her, his eyes filled with confusion and anger. "Talk about what?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly despite himself. Victoria sat down opposite him, looking him straight in the eyes. "Of me. Of who I really am." Mark frowned, unable to process her words. "You? What do you mean?" Victoria took a deep breath and began to reveal what he hadn't known from the start. "You've despised me our whole lives, Mark. You thought I was weak, naive, incapable. But beneath that guise, I possess an empire, influence, and wealth you never imagined." The words hit Mark like lightning. He felt his arrogance waver, replaced by deep confusion. "This is impossible," he muttered incredulously. Victoria continued, calmly and precisely. "Everything you thought you controlled, certain businesses, certain investments. I influenced them from the beginning. Every decision you believed was yours was, in fact, affected by me." Mark stepped back slightly, his hands shaking. "But, why? Why didn't you tell me?" Victoria smiled, both sweet and relentless. "Because I wanted you to understand the extent of your mistake. Underestimating a woman means forgetting that she can be stronger, smarter, and more strategic than you. And now you know it." The silence that followed was heavy. Mark realized that his entire life, his arrogance and pride, had blinded him. Victoria Somers, the woman he thought submissive and weak, had become his equal, and so much more. Victoria stood up, her gait a mixture of dignity and power. "This isn't just about money, Mark. It's about respect. And you need to finally give me that respect." Mark stood there, unable to respond. For the first time, he felt the humiliation and surprise of discovering he had been manipulated, not by an enemy, but by the woman he had underestimated. Victoria turned on her heel and left the room, leaving Mark alone with his thoughts, his shattered arrogance, and a new reality he could never ignore. The days following the revelation were a whirlwind for Mark Reynolds. He felt lost, humiliated, and unable to regain control of what he thought was his empire. Every decision he tried to make now seemed hampered by Victoria's strategic moves. She had transformed the house, the marriage, and even the business into a territory where he was no longer the master. Mark spent several nights poring over financial reports, emails, and business meetings, desperate to understand how he had been outmaneuvered. But every lead he followed only confirmed a truth he had always refused to face: Victoria Somers, his wife, was now the dominant force, and he was a helpless spectator. One morning, during a meeting with his partners, Mark tried to resume his leadership role. "We need to," he began, but his words were interrupted by a direct remark from one of the investors: "I think we should consult Victoria. She has already made decisions that have paid off more than your own initiatives." Mark felt his cheeks burn. He had never faced such public humiliation. Every word Victoria had spoken, every initiative she had quietly spearheaded, now surpassed him in visibility and influence. he finally understood that his arrogance had led him to underestimate his wife's true intelligence and strength. At home, Victoria watched silently. She didn't rejoice in excess, but each small triumph consolidated her position. She knew that Mark needed to learn to accept his superiority, not through brutal confrontation, but by recognizing his own limitations. One evening, while they were having dinner together, Victoria broke the silence. "Mark, you have to understand that this isn't about rivalry or revenge. It's simply that you've ignored my abilities for too long. And now it's time to respect the woman I am." Mark looked down, unable to answer. For the first time, he felt the weight of his past arrogance and contempt. His pride was hurt, and he knew nothing would ever be the same again. Victoria, on the other hand, remained calm, in control of the situation. Every gesture, every word was now under her control. She had not only revealed her wealth and intelligence, but had also restored a balance she had patiently built over years. As Mark silently left the table, head bowed, Victoria murmured to herself, with a mixture of satisfaction and serenity. "Well, you see now. Underestimating someone like me comes at a price. And you just paid that price." The months following Mark's fall were a time of complete transformation for Victoria Somers. She was no longer the woman who had been thought of as weak and submissive. She had taken control not only of her business, but of her life as well. Every decision, every move she made was now guided by her vision and inner strength, and no longer by the contempt or shadow of her husband. Victoria spent her days building her businesses, investing in ambitious projects, and establishing strategic partnerships with influential leaders. Her reputation grew, not only for her wealth, but also for her foresight and strategic acumen. She had become a figure of respect and admiration, admired for her patience, intelligence, and ability to turn adversity into opportunity. Mark, for his part, tried to react, but he was now a prisoner of his own past arrogance. He understood that every action he had taken against his wife, every word of contempt, had led to his own defeat. Victoria, silent and implacable, had transformed his contempt into strength and power. One morning, Victoria rose early and looked out at the city through the windows of her apartment building. The rising sun illuminated the skyscrapers and avenues, reflecting her success and independence. She felt free, truly free, for the first time in years. The woman Mark had scorned had become a powerful woman, respected, admired, and above all, in control of her own destiny. She smiled softly, thinking back on how far she'd come, the humiliations, the criticisms, the silent patience, and the strategic maneuvers that had ultimately shifted the balance of power in her marriage and her life. When she met Mark's gaze, now aware of his mistakes but powerless to reverse them, Victoria felt neither hatred nor resentment. She knew that her victory was not only material, but above all moral and psychological. She had restored respect, dignity, and recognition of her own worth. In the quiet of the house, she whispered to herself, "I'm no longer the underestimated one. I'm Victoria Somers, and I'm finally choosing my life." And for the first time in a long time, the world seemed to bow to her, not out of fear, but out of respect. The woman who had been scorned had become a silent legend of strategy, patience, and power, a complete, fulfilled, and unstoppable rebirth.